All right, so this is the second of our two 30-minute online trainings for our clerks for the 2026 election cycle. And this one is focusing on a brand new requirement in state law, which is for each county across the state to have a chain of custody plan. The chain of custody plan is a document that helps drive how we secure our election and how we document our election. And so we're going to walk you through all of those basics. We'll actually dive into the county's plan and then into the specific sections in our plan. And we'll do that all over the next 30 minutes. We're doing this for a couple of different reasons. One is because by state rule, we have to inform you of our chain of custody plan. But the main reason we're doing it is that we want you to see what is in our plan so that you can make a decision as a city, a school district, or a township clerk as to whether or not you want to use our plan for all of your elections or if you want to have your own plan for your own special elections. We'll talk more about that later. But we just kind of wanted to orientate you to what we're planning on covering and why we're covering it for you today. We have our contact information like we do in every slide, but I believe everyone has that. So we're going to skip right into the legal reason for why we have a chain of custody plan. The chain of custody plan is, like I said, a new requirement in law. If you want to read the law, you're welcome to see it there. But what it essentially says is that this plan is going to be applicable to the county auditor for any election that has a state, county, municipal, school district, or special district contest on that ballot in that county, right? We have to work with our neighboring counties if we have any school districts that cross over or any cities that cross over. And then we're also required to submit this to the Secretary of State's office every other June 1st. Every June 1st that we have a regularly scheduled state election, we have to update our plan with them. So the county is in compliance with this. That means that we have it in place for all of our jurisdictions. And like I said, we'll talk about it and whether or not you want to adopt it fully as your own or if you want to have your own chain of custody plan for any elections that you might be conducting on your own. I'll also just start out with a disclaimer that while this is a new requirement in law, Blue Earth County has had a chain of custody plan for quite some time. It was part of our emergency plans in the past. What this does is it formalizes it, creates it as its own document, and then has that more regimented update, whereas our plan would have been updated as necessary. All right. So what does this actually mean for you as a city clerk, a township clerk, or as a school district clerk? What it means is that you're obligated by that law to follow our plan whenever you're conducting an election or involved in an election that has your offices on the ballot, but also has federal, state, or county elections on the ballot. We're going to help you comply with that law by giving you the training and the details that you need. You'll see that here as we work through the half hour. We will also make a public version of the plan available upon request. We're still working through that ourselves with our county attorney as to whether or not we're going to publish it online or if we'll send it out to you or to others as requested. But this is the public version of the plan. There is a more robust, detailed plan that gets into some safety and security measures that we will not be making public unless ordered to do so by a court of law. So just know that we're going to take care of all of that for you, and we will make sure that you're comfortable with the plan through all of our training, especially the training for our live in-person polling place clerks, so the folks that are operating polling places on election day. You'll understand the chain of custody's details more as we talk about how you close the polls or how you pick up supplies and things like that. For the vast majority of our clerks that operate in a mail ballot environment or really have no intention of running their own election ever, our chain of custody plan is going to cover you and cover you at that high level that you need it to be applicable. However, as a local clerk, you are authorized under this law to create and utilize your own chain of custody plan for any election that you are going to be solely responsible for. And so think about any special elections for school referendums, or if you would end up with a March township election, you go down that path, or your city decides that they want to go to an odd year municipal election, then you can have your own plan, but you have to follow some pretty specific requirements. Um, and we would want to talk to you about that. So I'm assuming while you have that choice, most folks are going to choose to just fully adopt and operate under our plan, but I can't force that. And so if you do want to pursue the other local option, definitely let us know and we will reach out to you. Just know that you don't have to do anything different unless you want to do something different. Okay. So with the legal part out of the way, let's talk about what a chain of custody plan actually means and does. It is a policy document. What it really does is it lists the procedures and processes that are all tied to the people and products related to elections. So it has physical components, how we actually move things, how we protect things, but it also has cybersecurity components, how we ensure restricted access, how we prevent folks from infiltrating networks. All of those gatekeeping things are also included in our chain of custody plan. The chain of custody plan also has sample documents so everyone understands what they should be looking for a successfully completed chain in the chain of custody. And as I mentioned, it's required to be reviewed before each state election cycle, June 1st. So it's always current. And like I said, we've been doing it for a while. It's just now more formalized. For some of our clerks that have been around with us for a while, we've reached out to you in the past about our county election emergency plan. So think about this as very similar to that it's documenting processes and what we're going to do. However, there is some differences again with the level of security of some of the information that's included in the plan. Okay. More specifics about the basics, the foundation of the chain of custody plan. It really is a story of the election. So it ensures that we follow all state and federal laws and rules. It makes sure that we have safeguards in place to prevent errors and oversights. It talks about the checks and the balances that we do when we reconcile the ballot count each night of early voting, for example. It has examples of templates that have formulas built in to validate or check. It shows the tools that we're using to make sure the right ballots are being issued to the right voters. It also does walk through specific plans and processes so that we can make sure that we are following our consistent or our normal operations. It assigns responsibilities to folks to be responsible for those tasks in that process. It is our documentation guide, so it explains how we're going to document the returns of the election. It documents how we're handing off things to clerks. It has logs for recording actions that are associated with secure storage areas, things like that. It does create a paper trail when we're using all those templates and examples and logs that I've mentioned. And then it also talks about how we interact with our records retention and how records in the retention schedule can be retrieved and accessed within that schedule. Lastly, it's also a communication tool. We use it as a way to train staff members. It's being used to help you identify processes associated with the elections as a clerk, but it also, with that public component of it, can be used for communications if folks have questions about the security and the integrity of the election in Blue Earth County and in other counties across the state, as they will all have their plans as well. The plan actually can include some specific questions as we work through it. You can see those on the screen. It talks about who's seeing what, where are items going, how do we know that's the item that went there, how do we know when that item was moved. All those sorts of things get accounted for in our chain of custody plan as we create that documentation, that story of the election and the processes associated with the election. Okay. There are lots of resources online that talk about chain of custody plans. I grabbed just one example from a Federal Elections Assistance Commission. This is an example of a visual example. I'll be honest, ours doesn't have quite as many pictures in it. That kind of explains what the chain of custody looks like for ballots. I put this on the slide deck just to kind of show how it can be used as a public tool so folks can understand the way that the election is safeguarded. But it's also a training tool so that as we're explaining to new staff members or new election judges how we're actually working through the process, our chain of custody plan would walk us through the bullets that would be associated with our processes, the forms, the checkoffs that we're using, much the same way that this one does. Okay. It'll make some of the pieces that you're seeing in here are common to all of the chain of custody plans. You'll see them in some of the sections we talk about, where again, it's talking about what are we looking at? How are we accounting for those items? How are they being tracked? How are we validating that information? And then what are we doing with it? Where are we keeping it? How are we transferring it? That sort of stuff. And so with that background, we're actually going to dive into the county's chain of custody plan. That is the cover of our chain of custody plan. Like I said, not quite as prettied up with graphics as some of the federal examples that are out there, but it does the job and it has the information that we need in it. As I mentioned, the chain of custody plan has some private or protected sections under security provisions in law, and then it has sections that are public. We separated that out through the various sections that you're seeing on the screen. What lives in the general sections, that orange side, is all public, of course. And then the green section is where we have some redacted information that is not available to the general public. It's only available to folks with that business need to have access to it. What we include in our chain of custody plan is how the data is being classified. We're required to explain that when we're redacting or restricting access to government data. The plan also talks about how it applies to our local jurisdictions, kind of what we talked about a little bit earlier. The chain of custody plan also assigns responsibility for it. That's how we ensure that final check and balance, that the folks that have the authority to make a decision are identified as making that decision. It lists all of our jurisdictions, so there's no misunderstanding of who it applies to. It also has links to other plans that we have in place. We have a elections emergency plan. We have a continuity of operations plan. We have a communications plan. Those are all things that fall under our related planning section. Okay. Then as we move into the plan specifics, right, the sections of the plan itself, again, this is the story of the election. So we've divided our plan into all of these different processes, these major processes associated with the election. Each of these sections will be described in detail when we actually move on to the next slides. And then we end with an appendix that has the sample forms that I mentioned as part of any good chain of custody plan, so that folks know what they should be looking for to make sure the chain of custody plan was followed. As I mentioned, data classification has to be discussed when we're redacting or restricting access to government data. And so this is what we have in our plan. We are using the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act statute. That's Chapter 13. There's a provision in there that says data produced by the government can be restricted in its access to the public if it is security data under state law. We are invoking that claim for portions of our plan. Security data exemption applies when releasing that information would jeopardize the integrity of either the equipment or the process that would be involved. And so if we would reveal to you what our serial numbers were on equipment or what our coding was for our forms that are going back and forth, that would potentially open that up to unauthorized use. And so we restrict that sort of information. That'll make more sense when you see what is in our plan. And then I'll describe what would be seen in the non-public or in the security data portion. The appendix is generally public data. We've already removed the information necessary on there, but we have the disclaimer in case that would change in the future. Okay. The chain of custody plan is the responsibility of me as the chief election official. And then we also have an elections administrator who would be me in this instance, but in other jurisdictions that could be different. And then we would have folks that also have delegated or assigned responsibility for the chain of custody plan. So every chain of custody plan across the state would have some similarity to that. All right. So now we'll move into our sections of the plan. The plan, like I said, breaks down our major elections processes into these sections. And then what you're seeing on the screen, you're going to see on the next several slides. This is our public page of the plan. It is what we see as kind of the one pager, the introduction to what's included in the chain of custody for this section. So this is a good example of how we restrict or change access to the data. You'll see that it describes the process on the very top at a high level, summary level, kind of almost more like a title level. And then we start saying, okay, who's going to be responsible for making sure this is followed? When are we going to be reviewing it? Who's responsible for actually applying these provisions in the chain of custody plan? And then we have this last section that would say, hey, if a local jurisdiction wants to have their own plan, could their version of this section be different? So this ballot management one, this one that talks about the management of printed paper ballot stock, all the way from when the vendor produces that ballot to how we retain it after the election. If a city or a town or a school district wants to have their own plan that talks about ballot management, we're saying that that might exist and it might be different for all of our jurisdictions if they would choose to do it. Again, that's only if you were going to elect to have your own chain of custody plan. Some of these sections will actually say that no, you can't override it because the criteria in that section is such that you'd have to always comply with it. Okay, the rest of these section title pages provide information, or cover pages, I should say, provide a more narrative description of what that section includes. And so like in this one, you can see that it is talking about incorporating like the vendor process and the safeguards that the vendor has in place. But it's also talking about the processes that we have in place for ballot accounting and stuff like that. We always do a start and an end so that you can, as a member of the public, understand what we are talking about in this section of the plan. And then we also end with a why does it matter, a paragraph that explains why this is important. And so for the ballot management section, you can see that it's important because that paper ballot is always our backbone. It's our fail-safe to validate the will of the voter. And so it is incredibly important for us to make sure that A, the ballots are being produced correctly, and that they're being safeguarded from the minute they're run off of a press all the way through our 22-month retention schedule, and then how they're destroyed at that point in time. Who has access to them during that time? How do we know people aren't duplicating them without our authority? How do we know that the right number of ballots are coming back to us? All of those things are included in our chain of custody plan. The plan for this section also talks about blank ballots and how that's different than a voted ballot in terms of how it's maintained from a security perspective, as well as ballots that might have been used but not actually voted, i.e. a spoiled ballot or a ballot that might have been ripped or destroyed or something like that. So that's the layout for every section. I use the ballot management one as an example. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip through the next slides and just explain to you what is actually in that section now that you understand the way that the sections are orientated or designed. So our next section talks about voting that is occurring by envelope. So this was our absentee voting, our mail ballot voting, and also our UOCAVA balloting. These are all processes that are tied to votes that are occurring not in a polling place on election day because they're occurring via an envelope, and how we're going to manage everything from the actual production and receipt of the supplies to make sure that nobody has access to our supplies trying to send out their own version of absentee or mail balloting, all the way to how we accept and retain and secure those envelopes which contain voted ballots up through the time we can process them and turn them into election results. So this is really going to cover our entire life cycle for the envelope voting process, from how we distribute them to how we receive them back to voters, to how we accept them for the election, and then how we actually tabulate the results on them. Covers our entire 46 days that leads up to the election. This section is very heavy on how we verify the materials going out to make sure it's the right materials going out, and how we review the materials, the voted ballots and envelopes that are coming back to us to make sure that we are accepting them from eligible voters, that we validated that that voters return, and that they've only voted once in that election before we process it. This section has a lot of accuracy checks, ways that we make sure that the right ballot is being included in the packet and that the right packet is going to the right address. And then it also has a lot of storage and retention because it's a very paper-heavy process. Okay. This is an example of a section that cannot be overridden by a local plan. And the reason for that is this is all managed at the county level. If a school district was ever conducting their own election and was responsible for their absentee processes, they would be required to follow our processes because they're required in law, essentially. So this plan would have to be administered, this section of the plan. The next section, section number 3, talks about in-person voting, but this is in-person voting prior to election day. And so this talks about the processes and management of the materials for voting that's going to occur either at the courthouse or any of those other options for voting prior to election day, which would include healthcare facility voting, those temporary pop-up locations that could be on tribal land or at colleges and other post-secondary institutions. This also talks about the entire life cycle, from distributing those ballots to a voter in one of those locations to how it's received. The receipt is different here. It is received by a tabulator essentially for acceptance. The tabulator accepts it, and then the tabulator tabulates it. So while we use the same terminology, it's a slightly different life cycle. This one really does dive into the processes and procedures for the chain of custody of early voting, because that's the vast majority of this type of voting. And so it's how our county manages that process to ensure that only eligible Blue Earth County voters get ballots, that they haven't voted yet in the election, and that their ballot is promptly tabulated by the equipment in that early vote location. Same sorts of things with verification and accuracy and storage and retention all come into this portion of our plan. The primary difference with the previous section is that the retention and storage looks different because it's an actual voted ballot that has already been tabulated. So we have to be absolutely certain that we're securing those and that there's no manipulation that occurs to that ballot after it's been read by the tabulator. Next up is a section on reports, programming our tabulators so that they actually know how to read the ballots and the results reporting. I'm not going to take you through as much detail on the next several sections because these are all things that are happening at our office a little bit more directly, and so your interaction with this part of the plan will be limited. But it follows that same sort of process that we've been talking about. This one is just for those media sticks, the way that we tell those tabulators how to count the votes, and then also how we take the results that have been counted by those tabulators and report that to the public as unofficial results on election night and the days following the election. This is also a section that could technically be varied for a local plan. The reason it could be varied for a local plan is some of our jurisdictions would not be required to use programming, and so then this section would not be applicable in their version of the plan. Next up is section 5. This section is our equipment section. It describes the management of all of our voting equipment, the in polling place tabulators, our central counter, our high-speed tabulator, and our assisted voting devices. What this section does is it really gets to the process. It documents how we make sure that the vote on a paper ballot is going to be tabulated by the machine through the various testing and accuracy checks that we do, how we maintain that equipment to make sure that it is operational at all times. And then also how we secure that equipment between testing and between elections to make sure it stays secure. This would be an example where your local plan wouldn't actually include this. That's why it's NA in that section on that cover sheet. Because the equipment is in the possession of the county throughout the life cycle of the equipment. it gets distributed as a supply, and we'll talk about supplies in a later section. And that's how our city clerks and our township clerks that operate polling places would interact with the equipment. Section 6 gets into data and documents more. So this is our rosters or other elections related records that have protected information. So we also include our poll pads because that is an electronic version of our paper roster. It would also include anything that would have voters' private data on it. So completed election day registration forms that are printing out of the poll pads, greeters lists, copies of curbside voting certifications, those sorts of things. This section could be different for local plans, will be different for local plans because those poll pads are almost certainly not going to be used in those environments. So it changes for that use case. Same sort of layout as all those other sections there, focusing on the equipment and the records, how we maintain them, how we set them up, how we test them. All of those pieces come together there for us. Section 7 starts talking about the other miscellaneous supplies that go into the election, including the ballots when they're in transit to polling places. We talk about ballots and how we produce them and secure them. At one point in time in that process, they actually get handed out to polling places, distributed to polling places for use on election day. That's when they become a supply, and they're documented in the chain of custody processes in this section. This is really tied to verification and accuracy checks of the delivery and the return. So there's logs that get used here and sign-offs that identify equipment and who's receiving it and when. This section would not change for a local plan because if the county is responsible for the supply, we are going to have you always using our chain of custody to receive and then return that supply. Right. The next to last section for us, section number 8, is now moving to the post-election activities and how we secure all of the records of the election, how we use them, and how we would actually access them if necessary for a post-election process. And this one is really heavy on secure storage, who has access to storage areas. And then it even talks about re-storage and re-retention. So what happens if we have to open up a stored or retained record? How do we make sure that we've documented that that is still kept secure and intact? The last section is the electronic resources storage. And so this actually starts getting us to the very end of the elections story, where we would talk about how we properly destroy records and who makes that call and when that call is made. And then it also, of course, documents the access and activity associated with those records. Okay. This is purely a county process, so this portion of the plan would only apply to the county records. Okay. I mentioned earlier that we also have an appendix with sample forms. The long list of the sample forms in our chain of custody plan is listed here. This one on the screen is one that's an internal use ballot board use. So that's how it demonstrates how we document each step along the way of how an absentee or mail ballot is processed for counting. And so we would be completing these by team, by precinct throughout the election cycle, and just demonstrates that documentation. We also have a series of other sample forms. These are ones that are more in use by clerks. This is where you sign off for equipment, where we know we've handed off that equipment to you, how it's coming back, whether it's coming back. Your worksheets on how you make sure that you're returning the right number of ballots for the count of voters that you have, and then also how you actually return that, how we document that return at the end of the night. Again, just a sampling of the forms that we use as part of our chain of custody plan that are incorporated in as examples in our appendix. Okay. So lastly, as a summary for you in terms of what you need to do as next steps with your chain of custody plan, really, you don't have to do anything unless you and your councils or your boards wish to do something, right? You've got to use our plan whenever you're administering or involved in an election that has a county, state, or federal office on the ballot. But if you want to have something that would be in addition or separate for any standalone elections you might ever have, we need to talk about that and we can help you down that process. But again, if you don't want to do anything, you don't need to do anything other than acknowledge your certification form that you completed this training so that we can give you credit for that Minnesota rule that you have access to the chain of custody plan. The other reminder there is that we will have one more in-person election clerk class next week. Otherwise, you still have some online videos from the Secretary's office that you could be watching. And then next week or the week following, we'll send out an online form for you to certify all your training to us to get you to that 4 hours or 5 hours if you're a new clerk. With that, we will wrap up with more of our contact information if there's any follow-up questions. Otherwise, if folks have questions, you can drop them in the chat, or Christy's going to end the recording now, and we can also handle any of them in person. So again, thanks for your attention on this matter. Again, not new, but just kind of